I'd like to talk a little bit about battering and its impact upon victims. A reminder about the use of terms. Sometimes the term survivors is used as a preferential term rather than victims. Sometimes these terms are just used interchangeably. In the bigger picture, the use of victim or the use of survivor implies something about the stage of recovery that the victim or the survivor is in regards to the battering relationship, so that earlier on we may see the person more as a victim, later on more as a survivor. Although again, some people have a preference to use that term at any point those terms rather, at any point in the narrative regarding a battering relationship. From a previous textbook that I once used, I want to share a few quotes as I start into this discussion. One is, "It should be clear from previous discussions that although both males and females are sometimes violent, women are more likely than men to be victims of injurious abuse and homicide." You may have read information that suggests that women are perhaps even more violent in intimate relationships than men, but this statement alone should help clarify a little bit about why our focus is upon female victims generally when we talk about battering. Battered women experience many other adverse incidents that compound their misery. One wounding outcome with very negative consequences is the tendency of others to blame survivors of male to female intimate partner violence. Everyone is ready, if not eager, to place the blame for being in a violent relationship on battered women. There are many factors involved in blaming victims of intimate partner violence, and I just want to touch a little bit on several of them. One is being blamed by the partner, so that in these situations, it is not unusual for the perpetrators to hold the female partner responsible for their own abusive behaviors. She didn't clean the house, the kids are running wild, the towels weren't hung properly, the dinner isn't being prepared on time, all of those kinds of things. Society blames victims. More than 40% of those surveyed believe that women must be partly to blame for the assaults that occur in her relationships. And more than 60% believes that she would leave if she really were afraid. They don't really understand the dynamics that we're going to talk about in this discussion. Women who are non-traditional with gender roles also are blamed more by some in another survey. And we'll talk about same-sex battering more in depth in a later point in the semester. Sometimes victims are blamed by professionals, and this has a very profound impact upon their treatment. An example of this is the use of systems theory, which is lauded in many arenas as far as treatment of individuals with behavioral and emotional problems. The notion being that everyone in the family system has a part to play in supporting the errant behavior or the troubling behavior on the part of the primary client. This is also true sometimes in relation to working with alcoholic families and addict families as well. But the issue here is that this spreading of blame across many different individuals in the family system, or rather probably it's the spreading of responsibility across the other individuals in the family system, really does have a way of making the victim be partially responsible for the battering that occurs. And this is something that we really need to be very careful about when we're assessing situations involving battering in families. Even shelter workers, women shelter workers sometimes blame the victim. This is so interesting. Only 37% of shelter workers in a survey in 1993 held the batterer completely responsible for the abuse. And in a 1991 study, 14% agreed that victims asked for it. Now, I just want to point out that this was one of the events in our history that I believe recent history, that has had an impact upon our perception of battering and domestic violence, was the incident involving O.J. Simpson and his former wife when he murdered her and a friend of hers. This occurred in, I believe, 1994, and it really kind of opened up a discussion about domestic violence in society that we hadn't been having for some time. So just to point out that these studies were before that time, but still it's surprising to me that individuals working in women's shelter would still want to see the victims as being partly responsible for what happened. Child Protective Service workers is another area we need to be very cautious about. That victims sometimes are blamed for remaining with the abusive partner because they're not protecting their children. So the role of a non-abusing parent in an abusive situation is to protect the children from abuse and remove the children from danger. And so sometimes the non-offending spouse or the victim in a battering relationship has pressure put upon her to leave the relationship in order to protect the children. And again, as we'll talk about here and at other points in the semester, this is often very, very difficult for the victim to do for a number of different reasons. And so it, in a sense, threatens the victim with removal of the children if she doesn't do the very thing that she has difficulty doing. And you have to remember, she is a victim as well. And also keep in mind, women who try to leave abusive partners may be placing their own lives and those other children at risk. And we'll be talking about that in a few moments. The public and politicians whom they vote into office often blame welfare recipients for their lack of economic dependence, and many women who receive welfare are receiving welfare having left an abusive relationship. And so the pressure to get off of welfare sometimes encourages women to return to these abusive relationships. The other issue with this is that welfare recipients are required to identify the father of the children when they're applying for welfare benefits and to assist the welfare worker in locating that parent. And oftentimes that mother is trying to avoid giving away her identity and her location to the batterer, so that puts her in a very tough spot. Healthcare workers sometimes are concerned that battered women are not compliant with their recommendations. Doctors, for instance, insisting that battered women should leave their partners, don't see them doing that, don't really stop to understand why they don't, and just see the victim as being non-compliant with treatment recommendations. Unlike child abuse and neglect and elder abuse, domestic violence is not required to be reported in most states. And so, according to this slide, and there may be more now, 6 states where doctors are mandated by law to report abuse by intimate partners, but that is not universal at this time. Faith community leaders in a 2006 survey, most believe that the victims share part of the blame and that divorce should be the last resort because the family is a sanctified institution that needs to be supported at all costs. Staying with the perpetrator makes the victim blameworthy, or rather leaving the perpetrator, I would say, makes the victim blameworthy, but in other ways of seeing it, staying with the perpetrator also makes the victim blameworthy. So again, they're kind of stuck in a no-win situation there. Most enlightened spiritual advisors nowadays would be very cautious and would not recommend battered women to remain in a relationship for the sake of preserving a marriage, but there are still some out there who do that. When you get this blame from all these sources around you, of course, what happens a lot of times is you'll begin to blame yourself, and this leads to the victim having a notion that they provoked the violence, that they have to change their behavior to prevent it. And victims find very quickly that there isn't really a change in behavior that can stop violence in a battering relationship. Violence affects people and changes them forever. And some of the consequences of violence includes fear, in this case, a fear of the offenders, and an anxiety that is chronic in nature and leads the individual to being overly sensitive, perhaps, to cues leading to violence, because it then becomes generalized to all situations. And oftentimes they're seen as very fearful and timid, and they're often afraid to stand up for themselves in any situation, much less to stand up for their children. Women are significantly more fearful of IPV than are men. This may make male-to-female intimate partner violence qualitatively different, and this is one of the areas that I think we need to keep in mind when we talk about females prompting violence in relationships. There's a number of reasons that occurs, and it isn't always the same dynamics that come to play in males initiating battering. Fear conditioning causes neurological alterations. It changes the brain, and it sets up all sorts of stress reactions, post-traumatic stress, and those kinds of things, not unlike what happens with soldiers returning from combat situations. Victims often suffer from chronic apprehension. As a result of that, there be cognitive impairments, essentially because, they're living in the survival part of the brain, that fight or flight response, where they're always on guard and ready to defend themselves against an unpredictable, violent outburst. It isn't something that oftentimes is easy to see coming on at all. Victims will experience depression, aggression, will turn to substance abuse in order to assuage their feelings and to help them cope with things, suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, being very easily startled, and those kinds of things. The Center for Disease Control identifies four main types of intimate partner violence: physical abuse, and here's a whole list, and not all inclusive by any stretch of the imagination, but behaviors that are included in this: scratching, pushing, shoving, throwing, grabbing, biting, choking, shaking, slapping, punching, burning, use of a weapon, use of restraint, use of size and strengths. The interesting thing about this, and this is something to keep in mind, you see there's a range of behaviors here that goes from a simple push or shove all the way to using a weapon and burning and punching and choking individuals. This may be also part of the reason why it is that the surveys that we'll talk about a little bit later on by Strauss suggests that females are more violent in relationships than males. When you consider that this range of behaviors, it isn't all severe stuff here, even though it is considered intimate partner violence. Sexual violence is considered to be the use of physical force to compel a person into a sexual act against his or her will, as well as the attempted or completed sex acts involving a person with diminished capacity or the diminished ability to understand the act. And this includes persons that are disabled, who are ill, who are under the influence of substances, or because of intimidation or pressure, as well as any abusive sexual contact. A couple of things about this. More recently in the news, there was a case of a Stanford athlete who raped a woman who was under the influence of alcohol, and although he was convicted, the judge gave him a very, very light sentence, talking about his potential to have a better life. But Stanford University kicked him out, and he was required to register as a sex offender. Incidentally, that particular judge was recalled by the voters a year or so later for that decision. All 50 states now have an exception to what is called marital privilege. This was the notion that if you're married, a man has the right to demand sex at any time, whether the woman wanted to have sex or not. And believe it or not, it was really well into the 1970s before this became something that was no longer legal. There was a case in Oregon where a husband, actually he was separated, but showed up at his wife's apartment and forced her into sex. And long story short, that went to trial because Oregon had already instituted a marital rape law that didn't allow for marital privilege. The jury found him not guilty, interestingly. But many years later, some 30, 40 years later, he was accused of raping two women and in fact was found guilty that time, and I presume is in prison now. Aside from sexual violence, the threats of physical or sexual violence through words, gestures, use of weapons to communicate the intent to cause harm to the individual is also considered IPV. And psychological and emotional violence, this is trauma caused by acts, threats, or coercion, including things such as humiliation, controlling the victim, embarrassment of the victim, isolating, denying access to money or basic resources. And stalking is something that can be included in this category. Other forms of intimate partner violence that aren't necessarily listed by the CDC that I wanted to talk about here, including kidnapping, which is something that is probably more frequent than the non-intimate kidnapping among adults that we hear about. Stalking, and this is something that was mentioned in the last slide. This is sometimes something that's seen very early in a relationship as well as during the relationship, and then again becomes frequent or common during a breakup period. And this is a pattern of unwarranted behavior or unwanted behavior that involves such things as monitoring, harassing, repeatedly contacting a person, following the person. And it is a course of conduct, means that it involves repeated continuous behavior. So if seen separately as a single incident, they don't seem to be so alarming. But when the pattern of behaviors is considered all together and over time, it becomes more apparent and more alarming. And this would also include cyberstalking, by the way, which is a kind of a recent addition to the Chamber of Horrors in this discussion. Economic abuse is controlling a partner's access to money and economic resources, interfering in work, the perpetrator showing up at the victim's place of work and causing a scene there, stealing the victim's money, generating debt in the other person's name, those kinds of things. These are the kinds of things that prevent independence and self-sufficiency, and is one of the reasons why victims are often left with no choice but to remain in battering relationships. Spiritual abuse is something that sometimes isn't really considered, but this is also something that is prominent in many situations where it involves not permitting the victim to have contact with their religious leaders or their ceremonies or counsel in that regard, and also using scripture against the victim himself or herself. And finally, homicide, and the motives are very different. For men, homicide will usually be attributed to jealousy, whereas for women, it's more likely out of desperation resulting from previous violence or feeling of isolation. Battered women have poorer health than other people, oftentimes have a high body mass index. They suffer from more cervical cancer than others. They have more disabilities. They take more sick leave and they stay out of work longer, and they have more disturbed sleep patterns. Men cause far more injuries and cause more severe injuries than women cause to men. This is, again, an important thing to keep in mind. There is also a gendered pattern of injuries where the most common injury involves blunt force trauma to the face or being strangled, whereas victims of male batterers, they often suffer more complex fractures, orbital blowouts, that is, orbital bone around the eyes, intracranial injuries, those kinds of things, all can be very, very severe. There are individuals who work in shelters who would tell you also that one of the ways that you can really see that this isn't about a loss of control of anger, but really is kind of much more of a planned kind of thing, is that batterers oftentimes target areas of the body that are covered up by clothing and aren't frequently seen. And so oftentimes a battered woman, you won't see bruising sometimes in a battered woman because of where they've been injured. Battering diminishes the victim's ability to cope and makes the victim more prone to use passive strategies or avoidance strategies in dealing with this problem. Problem-focused coping is one way that has the least hopelessness. I'll deal with this when it comes up. I'll change my behavior so that he doesn't get upset, those kinds of things. To also placating and resisting, which really is very, very ineffective in many respects. The hostage syndrome is another consequence of the violence. The Stockholm Syndrome is something that's fairly well known, a situation where many years ago where individuals were held hostage by terrorists, as I recall, for quite a long period of time. This is in Stockholm, Sweden. And when they were finally freed from their captivity, many of them went on the stand, I guess, to testify on behalf of the captors. There was a lot of studies done about this, and determined really that in circumstances of extreme threat and isolation, victims will sometimes bond with the abuser, deny the abuse, even praise the abuser, and blame themselves for their situations. And it's really a strategy for survival, but it is something that becomes a very real thing to them. In these situations, the captor, or in this case the batterer, controls the conditions and will alternate threats of harm to the individual with periods of kindness and favor. But there's always that power differential that's very clear to the victims. And so the hostages become emotionally dependent on those who have subjugated them. And in this case, again, they were talking about the victim's hostage in a battering relationship. So the only way to survive is to avoid angering the captors. Threats of survival and isolation from others are the most powerful antecedents for predicting the development of the Stockholm Syndrome. So quite obviously, when somebody's held in a hostage situation by terrorists, particularly for any length of time, there's isolation and threats of survival. But the threats of survival and isolation are also hallmarks of a battering relationship in intimate partner violence as well. So traumatic bonding often results from this. The intermittently rewarded behavior is extremely persistent. So we'll be talking a little bit about why battering becomes intermittently rewarded. But there's a cyclical pattern of loving behaviors coupled with assault sprinkled in from time to time that may actually increase the victim's dependence on the abuser. And this might explain part of the reason why it is that the victim stays, and also why abused children sometimes you'll find have a very strong bond still with the abusive parent and sometimes want to be with the abusive parent rather than the parent who was non-abusing. A bond sometimes can be brought about through trauma and not in a healthy way. Doing nothing, the learned helplessness basically, may be the best survival strategy in these situations sometimes. The institutions that exist in our society often present obstacles make it very, very difficult to escape abuse. Economic institutions, legal institutions, religious institutions, family, et cetera, et cetera. Victims sometimes think they might be able to control the batterer's behavior by actually kind of surrendering control to them, but there was at least one study that suggested that none of a wife's behavior successfully suppressed a husband's violence once it began. All sorts of psychological disorders, including clinical depression, develop as a result of battering. Change in appetite, fatigue, all these kinds of things. But there are more serious things as well. For instance, suicide attempts are 4 times more likely for female victims of IPV. And while you often find depression in individuals who are suffering from a battering relationship, the study suggests that it is the battering that causes the depression. It's not a correlate of the depression. Again, oftentimes post-traumatic stress is the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, something that you'll see with female victims, not unlike those returning from combat situations. There is a significant correlation between the severity of the abuse and the victim's rating on psychopathology scale. So the more severe the abuse, the more serious the individual's psychological problems will develop. And women that have been involved in multiple abusive relationships fared much, much worse than others. There's a certain dynamic in a violent relationship that is worth talking about here. While relationships certainly are different from situation to situation, battery relationships tend to follow a general pattern. The beginnings of what is going to become battering really can be found oftentimes very early in the relationship, when the couple really begins dating seriously. And this is one of the things when you're working with young people that I encourage you to do, is to keep an eye on the dynamics between the male and the female in a dating relationship, because you can see signs of a developing control issue that can lead to battering. Everything early on seems very romantic in the relationship, and also I will say, I'm talking about he as the batterer, she as the victim, which again is a typical pattern in these situations that we're studying this semester. This can also occur, and much the same dynamics, of course, in same-sex relationships as well. But very early in a relationship, he communicates very often. He's always calling her, wanting to talk with her, wants to be with her all the time, wants to know what she's doing all the time, might call and check on her. And rather than seeing it as intrusive because she's falling in love, she sees this really as a loving pattern of behavior on his part. He can be very generous with gifts and provide her with all sorts of symbols of affection. He wants to be with her as much as possible and is jealous sometimes of any attention she might give to other men. And in fact, eventually, he becomes jealous of her desire to be with her friends, her same-sex relationships as well, and begins to intrude in them as well. And will also oftentimes try to cut off family contacts. I remember a situation of a young woman that I knew where her boyfriend, and she had a number of reasons why she was just very insecure in herself and her sense of independence and integrity and everything. And this young man comes along and is just sweeping her off her feet and is there all the time. When she goes to the bathroom down the hall, he stands outside the door until she comes out again. He's there to protect her and guard her. That seems a little odd, but I do remember that in this description. One of the fantasies that he had, he would write to her about how he was going to build a cabin in the woods, and he would take her to this cabin, and they would be away from her family and from his family, and it would just be the two of them, and they would have no one else interfering in their relationship. And this was really so many red flags that were there early in that relationship. Unfortunately, she did get out of that relationship, but I could see some serious things developing if she hadn't. One day, just because something happens, I don't know, he might slap her or hit her when he's upset about something. And almost immediately he starts to apologize and he begs for her forgiveness. Doesn't know what came over him that he would do such a thing. Swears it's never going to happen again. May turn up with, that's the hearts and flowers thing. He may show up with flowers or other signs of affection to demonstrate how much he loves her. And she's going to be quick to forgive him because she remembers those early days in that relationship and just how closely tied they were together and how kind and considerate and loving he could be. And that bout of violence is just something that happened, but she sees the old guy back again, and so she forgives him and remembers this potential for love and affection. And usually, oftentimes what happens in this kind of situation is they reaffirm their caring for each other in different ways, maybe going out on dates or whatever. But also one of the things that often happens is very, very passionate sex. We hear about makeup sex, and I'm not sure. I think this might even be more passionate than that. And the interesting thing about this, of course, is that provides a strong reinforcement. That's part of that reinforcement for this intermittent behavior we talked about that's so strong. This provides a reinforcement for the battering. So the relationship begins to return to the earlier patterns, and she's happy. She sees his caring behaviors again, and he seems to return to his kindly, loving self. And then one day something happens and another violent episode occurs, and it might very well be more severe than the last time. Right away, he apologizes, goes through the same thing again about how it's never going to happen anymore. She sees how distressed he is by this. I mean, she can see how much he means that he didn't mean to do this, and so she accepts his apology, and they have more reaffirmations of their love for each other, more passionate sex, again reinforcing that cycle for him. And every time the violence returns, it tends to become more severe, and the periods in between the violent episodes become shorter and shorter. And eventually, those periods of loving affection in between the battering episodes disappear altogether, and there's no more apologies. He may begin to blame her for his behavior, and she accepts the blame. Again, part of her remembers who that loving person is that he's in there, and many times she believes that if she just does what he expects of her, she's going to be able to bring that out of him again, and that batterer is going to go away. But he becomes psychologically abusive in many respects, and that what used to be that passionate makeup sex isn't so great anymore. It becomes forced sex, and sexual abuse begins to enter the picture. So you can kind of see this how this kind of battery relationship develops. And this is kind of a typical pattern for victims and batterers to go through. The cycle of violence here, for those of you that have worked with sex offenders, and those of you who have worked in substance abuse, you're familiar with this kind of pattern, this cycle model, and it is something that is used in many different areas in treatment with individuals and different kinds of problems. But if you start at the top with the tension building, and this tends to be the longest phase, where there are minor incidents of physical and emotional abuse, and the victim can sense sort of a growing tension in their relationship and tries to control the situation to avoid the violence. Again, it might be by being extra careful to get dinner done on time and to be sure the towels are hung properly and make sure the kids don't bother him when he comes home at night. But she's walking on eggshells. Doesn't want anything to go wrong, but she can't control this. This is something that she hasn't figured out yet. And so all of a sudden, something happens. There's this inevitable explosion. There's battering or abuse that occurs. It's as though he's totally out of control. And again, this is something that's going to happen more frequently, more severely, and tends to be the shortest stage, as you see that here in the cycle of violence also. Then after this passes, there's that honeymoon phase that we talked about where he's full of apologies and hearts and roses and promising never to be this way again. Everything gets all romantic all over again. And over time, as I mentioned earlier, this phase is going to just go away altogether, but it's still there through many different cycles. Now, in the center of all this is denial, and this is perhaps on both of their parts, that pretended it never happened, perhaps, or that it's not going to happen again. And this is the thing, this is sort of the engine that keeps this cycle going, that denial. And I think that's why it's in the center of the cycle. You see, it's sort of the fulcrum or whatever for this cycle. Again, remember that the explosive period is very short, but the honeymoon phase is going to go away. And eventually the tension building, it becomes shorter as well because it doesn't need that much to set him off once this pattern is firmly established. And so this cycle is something that can be very, very lethal. Again, remember, each time you go through this cycle, the cycle is going to happen more quickly. The cycle is going to involve more serious violence. Sometimes there are longer periods without violence in a relationship so that it may seem as though it's been remedied. That's perhaps it's typical, perhaps not. I mean, that seems to contradict a little bit about what I was just saying about how the interim period goes away. But it can happen that there are periods without violence. But that doesn't mean that the batterer is cured or that his promises are going to be kept, that he'll never do it again. The victim knows this inside, even though she doesn't want to believe it. She knows this. He might become violent to the children in a relationship, and she may see his abuse of her as saving the kids from further victimization. There are sometimes situations where the adult victims have seemed to prompt, in that tension building phase, they can sense that an explosion is coming and may do things to kind of prompt the violence. Now, again, understand, so I'm not blaming the victim here. I'm just saying that there may be actually a deliberate attempt to get the explosion to focus upon her in order to save their children from being the focus of the violence. He might become destructive of her possessions, and nothing is sacrosanct, and this might include killing or injuring the pets in the family, not only hurting the pet, of course, but harming all those that love the pet. And while a lot of this, if not most of it, almost all of it, is kept from public view, this could be happening next door to you, and you have no clue. This is very true. But also, as things go along and you get into that psychological phase of the abuse, he may begin to make demeaning comments about her in front of others and ridiculing her and humiliating her. And the other thing that may happen is that she won't be in front of others much because he's going to make every effort to isolate her from friends and family to keep all of this out of their consciousness and awareness. Sometime or another, the victim's likely to fight back, but if she does that, this usually results in greater violence from him. And again, this is something that inside most victims know. And if she finally, something happens, the neighborhood becomes aware of it, or she goes to a shelter, or she calls the police. If he's arrested and put in jail overnight, he's often more violent when he comes back. And if she fights back to defend her, even just defending herself, she may get arrested as well. This is another area where I think females being violent in intimate partner relationships, this is another incident where that happens, where she's defending herself or she's fighting back. Victims oftentimes are going to try to seek help through appropriate channels, but as I mentioned earlier, a lot of times the help that's needed just doesn't happen. Law enforcement used to see this as just something that happens in a family and really not an arena for law enforcement to intervene in. Quite some time ago, I remember the commander of the trooper station in Soldotna in a community meeting one time telling us that they had come to understand that domestic violence, what they were doing when they were going out on these DV calls, was looking at a murder in progress. That's the way he described it. And indeed, that tells you where it ends up. Eventually, the end result of this is that the victim is killed. And so this is why it's so very important to interrupt this cycle. And as we have heard in other places, oftentimes the victims have to leave the relationship in an average 7 to 10 times before they finally stay away. And there's a number of factors involved in this that explain this. Law enforcement has come to understand that this isn't, well, what they used to do, he said, was they'd get things calmed down. They'd send him out to take a walk around the block a couple of times to cool down. And the trooper would talk to the woman about what she can do to make sure this doesn't happen again, what it is that prompted it, and how can you make sure that, you don't do this anymore. Of course, we know this is not the way this isn't going to change things at all. But 20 or 30 years ago, this was the thinking in this area. And so I think we've moved along in this. Now the Alaska law requires that if there's an injury in a domestic violence call, someone has to get arrested. Now the unfortunate thing in this situation is that sometimes the woman fighting back will bruise the batterer as well, and she can be charged as well. And that's an unfortunate part of this, but one of the things that at least happens now is the law says that somebody's going to get arrested, and what they're going to be looking for are probably signs of bruises and things like that, some signs of injury. I think law enforcement's response has changed. Law enforcement will also tell you, I've heard this several times, that domestic violence calls are some of the most treacherous, dangerous situations for law enforcement to walk into. So lack of financial resources is a serious dilemma for battered women, and it's one of the primary reasons why they are stuck in these relationships. First of all, batterers a lot of times discourage their partners from working. They have this very hyper-masculine notion that they're the head of the castle, they're the ones that bring home the bacon, they're the provider, the strong provider, and the little woman shouldn't be out there working. She should stay home and take care of the kids and, make the home all nice and snuggly for him. And in fact, some batterers absolutely refuse to allow their partners to work. But for those that do have work, sometimes what will happen is the batterer will show up at work, sometimes cause a scene, sometimes just show up at the wrong time and intrude upon her ability to do her work. And this causes all sorts of problems at work for them. Understanding employer will see to it that the batterer is kept away from the work site, but isn't always successful at that. And when those situations bring danger to other persons, in those situations, sometimes the spouse, the victim, is going to lose her job. So a lot of times women who want to leave the abusive relationship don't have the financial resources they need to support their children because they're losing that income that the abuser provided. And so this lack of economic support then leads them to applying for public assistance and food stamps. And that just puts them into that whole arena of being shamed for being reliant on welfare and not working and that type of thing. In addition to that, childcare resources are very difficult to come by. Transportation, she may not even have her own transportation. Lack of living wage jobs out there make it very difficult for her to leave her abuser and be able to support her family. Another dynamic that occurs that isn't listed here, it's not necessarily about employment, but when she leaves with children, one of the things that happens frequently is the children's behavior becomes out of control. And some of that's a reflection of the anxiety they experience about their temporary situation and fears of some retribution by the abuser. But it also relates in part to the fact that the children have most likely been parented with fear as the motivator. So they know that if they stepped out of line when the abuser was in the home, they could get the hell beat out of them. And so they tend to be very, very well-behaved kids until the abuser wasn't on the scene. You know, you can't parent with fear, because when the source of the fear isn't there, there's no reason for children to act properly, because they haven't internalized the behaviors, correct behaviors. They manage their behaviors because they're afraid of external consequences. So when the source of that external consequence, that batterer, is removed from the relationship, they lose control oftentimes themselves. And the mother hasn't usually developed the parenting skills, to help the kids learn to adjust to a new way of being raised and disciplined and those kinds of things. And so another thing that oftentimes leads to the victims returning to their batterer is the fact that their children are just acting out so much and they're pulling their hair out trying to manage them, and they can't do it without the batterer in the picture. So victims really are going to need a lot of support when they do leave those relationships. And you have to watch for all of these things that might sabotage their leaving. We read about, I mentioned this a few times, females being, in surveys and studies, being shown to be perhaps even more frequently violent in intimate partner relationships than males. And I discussed a number of different reasons why that be, whether they be defending themselves or whether the definition of violence involves pushing, for instance. It's a very different thing than being punched and beaten and having your bones broken. And studies show, I think, that women are more seriously harmed by their male batterers than the other way around. Very consistently. Women are frequently treated in emergency rooms because of injuries from battering relationships. Not so much men. That said, it is true that there are male victims of intimate partner violence. Steinmetz, in fact, back in the 70s, argued that men suffered from battered husband syndrome. Most data sources clearly establish that women comprise the vast majority of victims in IPV situations. Steinmetz has suffered quite a bit of discrediting, I believe, and a lot of angst among the professional community because of these findings. Murray Strauss and his associates Richard Galic, I think, was another one, also studied this phenomena and found, I think many of the studies at least that you're reading about in the text involving females being more frequent batterers come out of these studies. They created the Conflict Tactics Scale, CTS, and it's a very controversial scale. It has been revised a few times and still remains controversial, but nonetheless, there are those professionals out there who have studied family violence who believe that women are as violent as men. Common sense seems to tell me the opposite. But again, when you think about the definition of violence and what's used in a study, these are some of the things you want to find out when you're reading these studies and consuming them. Is how do we define violence and battering? Where does it go? And what was the most frequent type of abusive behavior, let's say, that the male used versus what the female used? And how many of the victims needed treatment or were seriously injured? Those kinds of things might explain a lot about, while on the surface the statistics say one thing, our experience in the field tells us a whole different thing. Women are more likely to be injured, and they are more likely to be injured more seriously. There was a study that said that injured men were likely to be batterers injured while committing battery. But other studies do point to the presence of male victims of both female and male intimate partner violence. Males identified in one episode as victims are likely to be the perpetrators in the next episode. So male partner abuse victims suffer from more heart attacks, heart disease, and higher cholesterol than non-victims. So there are instances where male victims are out there. The services, of course, you ask then, why is it that the services don't offer anything for battered males? And I think you're looking at the effects of patriarchy, among other things. Women are going to have a much harder time finding work, particularly without a stable work history, than men. Men fare better in the economic market, and it is much easier for a man to establish himself separate from a partner than it is for a female who's been dependent in a relationship on a male. So those are some of the things to consider when we look at the effects of battering on victims. And I hope this causes you to give some thought to this and perhaps come up with some questions or something to discuss in our next class meeting. Let me know if anything comes up in the meantime, but thanks for listening as always.